Welcome to this selection from Such Is Life, being certain extracts from the Diary of Tom Collins, written by Joseph Furphy. We start at the beginning, with Tom Collins' introduction and the start of Chapter 1, where Tom explains to us what he is going to write. Introduction. Contrary to usage, these memoirs are published not in compliance with the entreaties of friends, but in direct opposition thereto. It has been pointed out to me that the prizes of civilization, municipal dignity, church wardenship, the honorary bench, and so forth, do not wait upon avowed comradeship with people who can by no management of hyperbole be called respectable. But there is a grim, fakir-like pleasure in any renunciation of desirable things when the line of least resistance leads in a contrary direction. And in my own case, the impulse of reminiscence, fatally governed by an inveterate truthfulness, is wayward enough to overbear all hope of local preeminence, as well as all sense of literary priority. Hence these pages. Tom Collins. Chapter 1. Unemployed at last. Scientifically, such a contingency can never have befallen of itself. According to one theory of the universe, the momentum of original impress has been tending toward this far-off divine event ever since a scrap of fire mist flew from the solar centre to form our planet. Not this event alone, of course, but every occurrence past and present from the fall of captured Troy to the fall of a captured insect. According to another theory, I hold an independent diploma as one of the architects of our social system, with a commission to use my own judgment and take my own risks like any other unit of humanity. This theory, unlike the first, entails frequent hitches and cross-purposes, and to some malign operation of these I should owe my present holiday. Orthodoxly, we are reduced to one assumption, namely, that my indomitable old adversary has suddenly called to mind Dr. Watts's friendly hint respecting the easy enlistment of idle hands. Good. If either of the two first hypotheses be correct, my enforced furlough tacitly conveys the responsibility of extending a ray of information, however narrow and feeble, across the path of such fellow pilgrims as have led lives more sedentary than my own, particularly as I have enough money to frank myself in a frugal way for some weeks, as well as to purchase the few requisites of authorship. If, on the other hand, my supposed safeguard of drudgery has been cut off at the metre by that amusingly short-sighted old conspirator, it will be only fair to notify him that his age and experience, even his captivating habits and well-known hospitality, will be treated with scorn rather than respect in the paragraphs which he virtually forces me to write, and he is hereby invited to view his own feather on the fatal dart. Whilst a peculiar defect, which I scarcely like to call an oversight in mental construction, shuts me out from the flowery pathway of the romancer, a coordinate requital endows me, I trust, with the more sterling, if less ornamental qualities of the chronicler. This fairly equitable compensation embraces, I have been told, 3 distinct attributes: an intuition which reads men like signboards, a limpid veracity, and a memory which habitually stereotypes all impressions except those relating to personal injuries. Submitting, then, to the constitutional interdict already glanced at, and availing myself of the implied license to utilize that homely talent of which I am the bailee, I purpose taking certain entries from my diary and amplifying these to the minutest detail of occurrence or conversation. This will afford to the observant reader a fair picture of life as that engaging problem has presented itself to me. 22 consecutive editions of Letz's pocket diary, with 1 week in each opening, lie on the table before me, all filled up and in a decent state of preservation. I think I shall undertake the annotation of a week's record. A man might, if he were of a fearful heart, stagger in this attempt. But I shut my eyes and take up one of the little volumes. It proves to be the edition of 1883. Again I shut my eyes while I open the book at random. It is the week beginning with Sunday, the 9th of September. Sunday, September 9, Thompson, Cooper, etc., 10 Mile Pines, Cleopatra, Duff selection. At the start of Chapter 2, however, Tom has changed his mind. Chapter 2. When I undertook the pleasant task of writing out these reminiscences, I engaged, you will remember, to amplify the record of 1 week, judging that a rigidly faithful analysis of that sample would disclose the approximate percentage of happiness, virtue, etc. in life. But whilst writing the annotations on September 9th, which, by the way, gratuitously overlap on the following day, I saw an alpine difficulty looming ahead. At the Blowhard Sandhill on the night of the 10th, I camped with a party of 6 sons of Belial bound for Deniliquin with 3,000 Bulka wethers off the shears. Now, anyone who has listened for 4 hours to the conversation of a group of sheep drovers, named respectively Splodger, Rabbit, Parson, Bottler, Dingo and Hairy-Toothed Ike, will agree with me as to the impossibility of getting the dialogue of such dramatis personae into anything like printable form. The bullock drivers were bad enough, but these fellows are out of the question. Then it occurred to me that a wider scope of observation might give in perhaps fewer pages a fairer estimate of that ageless enigma, the true solution of which forms our all-embracing and only responsibility. I therefore concluded to skip 1 calendar month, dipping again into my old diary at October 9th in the same year, namely 83. After this, I shall pick out of each consecutive month the 9th day for amplification and comment, keeping not too long in one tune, but a snip and away. This will prospect the gutter of life, gutter is good, at different points. In other words, it will give us a range of 7 months instead of 7 days. The thread of narrative being thus purposely broken, no one of these short and simple analyses can have any connection with another, a point on which I congratulate the judicious reader and the no less judicious writer, for the former is thereby tacitly warned against any expectation of plot or denouement, and so secured against disappointment, whilst the latter is relieved from the, to him, impossible task of investing prosaic people with romance and a generally haphazard economy with poetical justice. Go to, then. Tuesday, October 9, Golambala. 2 Rories. Later in Chapter 2, Tom meets Rory O'Halloran again after 13 years. Tom goes to Rory's hut and meets his wife and his daughter Mary. A neatly dressed child in a vast white sunbonnet ran toward me as I came in sight, but presently paused and returned at the same pace. On reaching the door, I was met by a stern-looking woman of 30-odd, to whom I introduced myself as an old friend of Mr. O'Halloran's. I had leisure to observe the child critically as she sat bareheaded beside Rory at the tea-table, glancing from time to time at me for the tribute of admiration due to each remark made by that nonpareil of men. She was not only a strikingly beautiful child, but the stamp of child that expands into a beautiful woman. In spite of her half-Anglican lineage and Antipodean birth, there was something almost amusing in the strong racial index of her pure Irish face. The black hair and eyebrows were there, with eyes of indescribable blue, the full shapely lips and that delicate contour of chin which specially marks the highest type of a race which is not only non-Celtic but non-Aryan. Mary O'Halloran was perfect young Australian. To describe her from after-knowledge, she was a very creature of the phenomena which had environed her own dawning intelligence. She was a child of the wilderness, a dryad among her kindred trees. The long-descended poetry of her nature made the bush vocal with pure gladness of life, endowed each tree with sympathy, respondent to her own fellowship. She knew the dwelling place of every loved companion, and by necessity she had her own names for them all, since her explorations were carried out on Rory's shoulders or on his saddle, and technicalities never troubled him. To her it was a new world, and she saw that it was good. Rory was her guide, philosopher and crony. He was her overwhelming ideal of power, wisdom and goodness. He was her help in ages past, her hope for years to come. No irreverence intended here, quite the reverse, for if true family life existed, we should better apprehend the meaning of Our Father who art in heaven. He was her Ancient of Days, her shield, and her exceeding great reward. A new position for Rory, and he grasped it with all the avidity of a love-hungered soul. The whole current of his affections, thwarted and repulsed by the world's indifference, found lavish outlet here. Now we go to Chapter 5. Wednesday, January the 9th, 1984 in Tom Collins's diary, where Tom recounts the story of the lost child as it was told around the campfire by Tom's friend Steve Thompson. You'll notice that Thompson refers to Rory as Dan. Irishmen were often given the nickname Dan O'Connell after a famous Irish political leader in the first half of the 19th century. It's an Australian thing, isn't it? Thompson told a story well. I verily believe he used to practice the accomplishment mentally as he sauntered along beside his team. He knew his own superiority here, his acquaintances knew it too, and they also knew that he knew it. Hence, they were reluctant to minister occasion to his egotism. Speaking of Bob, he continued listlessly, I met him in the hut at Kalkaroo on the evening I got there with the load. He was on his way down from that new place of McGregor's where he's been, and he had come round by Kalkaroo to see one of the very few friends he has in the world. But he lost his labour, for this cove had left the station more than a year before. However, we had been yarning for hours, and the station chaps were about turning in when we heard someone coming in a hurry. No less than Webster himself. First time he had been in the hut since it was built, the chaps told me afterward. He had a leaf of a memorandum book in his hand, and, says he, child lost in the scrub on Goolambulla, Dan O'Connell's little girl, 5 or 6 years old. Anybody know where there's any blackfellas? Nobody knew. Well, raise horses wherever you can and clear at once, says he. One man for the next couple of days will be worth a regiment very shortly. As for you, Thompson, says he, you're your own master. Of course I was only too glad of any chance to help in such a case, so I went for my horse at once. Bob had duffed his 2 horses into the ration paddock on his way to the hut and had put them along with my mare so that he could find them at daylight by the sound of her bell. This started me and him together. He lent his 2nd horse to one of the station chaps, and the 3 of us got to Goolambulla just after sunrise, first of the crowd. 25 mile. There was tucker on the table and chaff for our horses, and during the 20 minutes or so that we stayed, they gave us the outline of the mishap. Seems that for some reason or other, valuation for mortgage, I'm thinking, the classer had come round a few days before and Spanker had called in every man on the station to muster the ewes. You know how thick the scrub is on Goolambulla? Dan came in along with the rest, leaving his own place before daylight on the first morning. They swept the paddock the first day for about 3 parts of the ewes. The second day they got most of what was left, but Spanker wanted every hoof if possible, and he kept all hands on for the 3rd day. Seems the little girl didn't trouble herself the first day, though she hadn't seen Dan in the morning, but the second day there was something peculiar about her, not fretful but dreaming, and asking her mother strange questions. It appears that up to this time she had never said a word about the man that was found dead near their place a couple of months before. She saw that her parents didn't want to tell her anything about it, so she had never showed any curiosity. But now her mother was startled to find that she knew all the particulars. It appears that she was very fond of her father, and this affair of the man perishing in the scrub was working on her mind. All the second day she did nothing but watch, and during the night she got up several times to ask her mother questions that frightened the woman. The child didn't understand her father going away before she was awake and not coming back. Still, the curious thing was that she never took her mother into her confidence and never seemed to fret. Anyway, on the third morning after breakfast, her mother went out to milk the goats, leaving her in the house. When the woman came back, she found the child gone. She looked round the place and called and listened and prospected everywhere for an hour. Then she went into the house and examined. She found that the little girl had taken about a pint of milk in a small billy with a lid and half a loaf of bread. Then, putting everything together, the mother decided that she had gone into the scrub to look for her father. There was no help to be had nearer than the home station, for the only other boundary man on that part of the run was away at the muster. So she cleared for the station, 12 mile, and got there about 3 in the afternoon, not able to stand. There was nobody about the station but Mrs. Spanker and the servant girl and the cook and the chow slushy, and Mrs. Spanker was the only one that knew the track to the ewe paddock. However, they got a horse in and off went Mrs. Spanker to give the alarm. Fine woman, daughter of old Walsh, storekeeper at Mugajinna on the Deniliquin side. It would be about 5 when Mrs. Spanker struck the ewe paddock and met Broom and another fellow. Then the three split out to catch whoever they could and pass the word round. Dan got the news just before sundown. He only remarked that she might have found her own way back. Then he went for home as hard as his horse could lick. As the fellas turned up, one after another, Spanker sent the smartest of them, one to Culkaroo and one to Malpa, and 2 or 3 others to different fences and tank sinkers' camps. But the main thing was blackfellas. Did anybody know where to find a blackfellow now that he was wanted? Seems there had been about a dozen of them camped near the tank in the cattle paddock for a month past, but they were just gone, nobody knew where. And there had been an old lubra and a young one camped within a mile of the station, and an old fella and his lubra near one of the boundary men's places. But they all happened to have shifted, and no one had the slightest idea where they could be found. However, in a sense, everyone was after them. But as I was telling you, we had some breakfast at the station and then started for Dan's place. 7 of us by this time, for another of the Culkaroo men had come up and there were 3 well sinkers in a buggy. This was on a Thursday morning and the little girl had been out 24 hours. Well, we had gone about 7 mile with crowds of fresh horse tracks to guide us, and we happened to be going at a fast shog and Bob riding a couple or 3 yards to the right when he suddenly wheeled his horse round and jumped off. "How far is it yet to Dan's place?" says he. 5 miles, says one of the well sinkers. "We're just on the corner of his paddock. Got tracks?" "Yes," says Bob. "I'll run them up while you fetch the other fellas. Somebody look after my horse." And by the time the last word was out of his mouth, he was 20 yards away along the little track. No trouble in following it, for she was running the track of somebody that had rode out that way a few days before, thinking it was her father's horse, poor little thing. Apparently she had kept along the inside of Dan's fence the way she had generally seen him going out, till she came to the corner where there was a gate. Then she had noticed this solitary horse's track striking away from the gate out to the left, and she had followed it. However, half a mile brought us to a patch of hardish ground where she had lost the horse's track, and there Bob lost hers. Presently he picked it up again, but now there was only her little boot marks to follow. "A good dog would be worth 50 men there, I think," suggested Hellsmoke. "Same thought struck several of us, but it didn't strike Bob," replied Thompson. "Fact, the well sinkers had brought a retriever with them in the buggy, a dog that would follow the scent of any game you could lay him on, but they couldn't get him to take any notice of the little girl's track. Never been trained to track children, and how were they going to make him understand that a child was lost?" However, while two of the well sinkers were persevering with their retriever, the other fellow drove off like fury to fetch Dan's sheepdog, making sure that we would only have to follow him along the scent. In the meantime, I walked behind Bob, leading both our horses. "Give him his due. He's a great tracker." I compare tracking to reading a letter written in a good business hand. You mustn't look at what's under your eye. You must see a lot at once and keep a general grasp of what's on ahead, besides spotting each track you pass. Otherwise, you'll be always turning back for a fresh race at it. And you must no more confine yourself to actual tracks than you would expect to find each letter correctly formed. You must just lift the general meaning as you go. Of course, our everyday tracking is not tracking at all. However, Bob run this little track full walk mile after mile in places where I wouldn't see a mark for 50 yards at a stretch on account of rough grass and dead leaves and so forth. One thing in favour of Bob was that she kept a fairly straight course, except when she was blocked by porcupine or supplejack. Then she would swerve off and keep another middling straight line. At last, Bob stopped. "Here's where she slept last night," says he. And we could trace the marks right enough. We even found some crumbs of bread on the ground and others that the ants were carrying away. She had made 12 or 14 mile in the day's walk. By this time several chaps had come from about Dan's place and they were still joining us in twos and threes. As fast as they came, they scattered out in front, right and left, and one cove walked a bit behind Bob with a frog bell, shaking it now and then to give the fellas their latitude. This would be about 2 in the afternoon or half past, and we pushed along the track she had made only a few hours before with good hopes of overtaking her before dark. The thing that made us most uneasy was the weather. It was threatening for a thunderstorm. At this time we were in that unstocked country southeast of the station. Suddenly Bob rose up from his stoop and looked round at me with a face on him like a ghost. "God help us now if we don't get a black fella quick," says he, pointing at the ground before him. And sure enough, there lay the child's little copper-toed boots, where she had taken them off when her feet got sore and walked on in her socks. It was just then that a tank sinker drove up with Dan and his dog in the buggy. "Poor old Rory," I interposed. "Much excited?" "Well, no, but there was a look of suspense in his face that was worse. And his dog, a dog that had run the scent of his horse for hundreds of miles all put together, that dog would smell any plain track of the little stocking foot only a few hours old and would wag his tail and bark to show that he knew whose track it was, and all the time showing the greatest distress to see Dan in trouble. But it was no use trying to start him on the scent. They tried 3 or 4 other dogs with just the same success. But Bob never lost half a second over these attempts. He knew. Anyway, it was fearful work after that. With the thunderstorm hanging over us, Bob was continually losing the track and us circling round and round in front, sometimes picking it up a little further ahead. But we only made another half mile or 3/4 at the outside before night was on. I dare say there might be about 25 of us by this time, and 18 or 20 horses and 2 or 3 buggies and wagonettes. Some of the chaps took all the horses to a tank 6 or 8 mile away, and some cleared off in desperation to hunt for blackfellas, and the rest of us scattered out a mile or 2 ahead of the last track to listen. They had been sending lots of tucker from the station, and before the morning was grey everyone had breakfast and was out again. But do what we could, it was slow, slow work. And Bob was the only one that could make any show at all in running the track. Friday morning, of course, and by this time the little girl had been out for 48 hours. At 9 or 10 in the forenoon, when Bob had made about half a mile, one of the Kalkaroo men came galloping through the scrub from the right, making for the sound of the bell. "Here, Bob," says he, "we've found the little girl's billy at the fence of Peter's paddock, where she crossed. Take this horse, about 2 miles straight out there." I had my horse with me at the time, and I tailed up Bob to the fence. He went full tilt, keeping the track that the horse had come, and this fetched us to where a couple of chaps were standing over a little billy with a lump of bread beside it. She had laid them down to get through the fence and then went on without them. The lid was still on the billy, and there was a drop of milk left. The ants had eaten the bread out of all shape. But Bob was through the fence and bowling down a dusty sheep track where a couple of fellas had gone before him and where we could all see the marks of the little bare feet, for the stockings were off by this time. But in 60 or 80 yards this pad ran into another, covered with fresh sheep tracks since the little girl had passed. Nothing for it but to spread out and examine the network of pads scattered over the country. All this time the weather was holding up, but there was a grumble of thunder now and then, and the air was fearfully close. At last there was a cooee out to the left. Young Broom had found 3 plain tracks about half a mile away. We took these for a base, but we didn't get beyond them. We were circling round for miles without making any headway, and so the time passed till about 3 in the afternoon. Then up comes Spanker with his hat lost and his face cut and bleeding from the scrub and his horses in a white lather and a black lubra sitting in the back of the buggy and the Malpa stockkeeper tearing along in front giving him our tracks. She was an old grey-haired lubra, blind of one eye, but she knew her business and she was on the job for life or death. She picked up the track at a glance and run it like a bloodhound. We found that the little girl hadn't kept the sheep pads as we expected. Generally, she went straight till something blocked her. Then she'd go straight again at another angle. Very rarely, hardly ever, we could see what signs the lubra was following, but she was all right. Uncivilised even for an old lubra. Nobody could yabber with her but Bob, and he kept close to her all the time. She began to get uneasy as night came on, but there was no help for it. She went slower and slower, and at last she sat down where she was. We judged that the little girl had made about 17 mile to the place where the lubra got on her track, and we had added something like 4 to that. Though mind you, at this time we were only about 12 or 14 mile from Dan's place, and 8 to 10 mile from the home station. Longest night I ever passed, though it was one of the shortest in the year. Eyes burning for want of sleep and couldn't bear to lie down for a minute. Wandering about for miles, listening, hearing something in the scrub and finding it was only one of the other chaps or some sheep. Thunder and lightning on and off all night, even 2 or 3 drops of rain toward morning. Once I heard the howl of a dingo and I thought of the little girl lying worn out, half asleep and half fainting, far more helpless than a sheep, and I made up my mind that if she came out safe I would lead a better life for the future. However, between daylight and sunrise, being then about a mile or a mile and a half from the bell, I was riding at a slow walk, listening and dozing in the saddle when I heard a faraway call that sounded like, "Daddy!" It seemed to be straight in front of me, and I went for it like mad. Hadn't gone far when Williamson, the Narangi, was alongside me. "Hear anything?" says I. "Yes," says he. "Sounded like Daddy. I think it was out here." "I think it was more this way," says I, and each of us went his own way. When I got to where I thought was about the place, I listened again and searched round everywhere. The bell was coming that way, and presently I went to meet it, leading my horse and still listening. Then another call came through the stillness of the scrub, faint but beyond mistake. "Daddy!" There wasn't a trace of terror in the tone. It was just the voice of a worn-out child deliberately calling with all her might. Seemed to be something less than half a mile away, but I couldn't fix on the direction and the scrub was very thick. I hurried down to the bell. Everyone there had heard the call, or fancied they had, but it was out to their right, not in front. Of course, the lubra wouldn't leave the track, nor Bob, nor the chap with the bell. But everyone else was gone, Dan among the rest. The lubra said something to Bob. "Piccaninny tumbled down here again," says Bob, "getting very weak on her feet." By and by, "Piccaninny plenty tumble down." It was pitiful, but we knew that we were close on her at last. By this time, of course, she had been out for 72 hours. I stuck to the track with the lubra and Bob. We could hear some of the chaps cooeying now and again and calling, "Mary!" Bad line, muttered Saunders impatiently. "Seemed to confuse things anyway," replied Thompson, and it was very doubtful whether the little girl was likely to answer a strange voice. At last, however, the lubra stopped and pointed to a sunbonnet all dusty lying under a spreading hop bush. She spoke to Bob again. "Piccaninny sleep here last night," says Bob. And that was within 100 yards of the spot I had made for after hearing the first call. I knew it by 3 or 4 tall pines among a mass of pine scrub. However, the lubra turned off at an angle to the right and run the track not an hour old toward where we had heard the second call. We were crossing fresh horse tracks every few yards, and never 2 minutes but what somebody turned up to ask the news. But to show how little use anything was except fair tracking, the lubra herself never saw the child till she went right up to where she was lying between 2 thick, soft bushes that met over her and hid her from sight. "Asleep?" I suggested with a sinking heart. No. She had been walking along less than half an hour before, and she had brushed through between these bushes to avoid some prickly scrub on both sides, but there happened to be a bilby hole close in front, and she fell in the sort of trough with her head down the slope. And that was the end of her long journey. It would have taken a child in fair strength to get out of the place she was in, and she was played out to the last ounce. So her face had sunk down on the loose mould and she had died without a struggle. Bob snatched her up the instant he caught sight of her, but we all saw that it was too late. We cooeyed and the chap with the bell kept it going steady. Then all hands reckoned that the search was over, and they were soon collected round the spot. Now that little girl was only 5 years old, and she had walked nothing less than 22 miles, might be nearer 25. There was a minute's silence. Personal observation or trustworthy report had made every one of Thompson's audience familiar with such episodes of new settlement. And for that very reason, his last remark came as a confirmation rather than as an overstatement. Nothing is more astonishing than the distances lost children have been known to traverse. "How did poor Rory take it?" I asked. "Dan? Well, he took it bad. When he saw her face, he gave one little cry like a wounded animal. Then he sat down on the bilby heap with her on his knees, wiping the mould out of her mouth and talking baby to her. Not one of us could find a word to say. But in a few minutes we were brought to ourselves by thunder and lightning in earnest, and the storm was on us with a roar. And just at this moment Webster of Kalkaroo came up with the smartest black fellow in that district. We cleared out one of the wagonettes and filled it with pine leaves and laid a blanket over it, and Spanker gently took the child from Dan and laid her there, spreading the other half of the blanket over her. Then he thanked all hands and made them welcome at the station if they liked to come. I went, for one, but Bob went back to Culkaroo direct, so I saw no more of him till tonight. Poor Dan. He walked behind the wagonette all the way, crying softly like a child and never taking his eyes from the little shape under the soaking wet blanket. Hard lines for him. He had heard her voice calling him not an hour before, and now, if he lived till he was 100, he would never hear it again. As soon as we reached the station, I helped Andrews, the storekeeper, to make the little coffin. Dan wouldn't have her buried in the station cemetery. She must be buried in consecrated ground at Hay. So we boiled a pot of gas tar to the quality of pitch and dipped long strips of wool bale in it and wrapped them tight round the coffin after the lid was on till it was 2-ply all over and as hard and close as sheet iron. Aye, and by this time more than a dozen blackfellows had rallied up to the station. Spanker arranged to send a man with the wagonette to look after the horses for Dan. The child's mother wanted to go with them, but Dan refused to allow it, and did so with a harshness that surprised me. In the end, Spanker sent Ward, one of the Narangis. I happened to camp with them 4 nights ago when I was coming down from Culkaroo and they were getting back to Goolambulla. However, added Thompson with sublime lowliness of manner, that's what I meant by saying that in some cases a person's all the better for being uncivilised. You see, we were nowhere beside Bob, and Bob was nowhere beside the old lubra. Had you much of a yarn with the poor fellow when you met him? I asked. Evening and morning only, replied Thompson, maintaining the fine apathy due to himself under the circumstances. I was away all night with the bullocks in a certain paddock, didn't recognise me, but I told him I had been there. And then he would talk about nothing but the little girl. Catholic priest in Hay sympathised very strongly with him, he told me, but couldn't read the service over the child on account of her not being baptised. So Ward read the service. His people are English Catholics. Most likely Spanker thought of this when he sent Ward. Dan didn't seem to be as much cut up as you'd expect. He was getting uneasy about his paddock, and he thought Spanker might be at some inconvenience. But that black beard of his is more than half white already. And something like me, I never thought of mentioning this to Bob when he was here. Absence of mind. Bad habit. This Dan has much to be thankful for, remarked Stevenson with strong feeling in his voice. Suppose that thunderstorm had come on a few hours sooner. What then? There was a silence for some minutes. Thompson's story of the search for Mary O'Halloran leads the Bullockys to recall their own experiences of searching for other lost children. Tell you what made me interrupt you, Thompson, when I found fault with singing out after lost kids, observed Saunders at length. Instigation of many a poor little child, perishing unknownst. Seen one instance when I was putting up a bit of fence on Grundle, 134 chain and some links, 40-odd links if I don't disremember, top rail and 6 wires. Just cutting off a bend of the river to make a handy cattle paddock. They'd had it fenced off with deadwood 12 or 15 years before, but when they got it purchased, they naturally went in for a proper fence. And you can't lick a top rail and 6 wires with 9-foot panels. You're a bit of an authority on fencing, remarked Baxter dryly. Well, as I was saying, continued Saunders, this kid belonged to a married man named Tom Bracey that was working mates with me. One night when his missus drafted the lot, she made one short, and she hunted round and called and got excited, and you couldn't blame the woman. Well, we hunted all night, me and Tom and Cunningham, the cove that was engaged to carp the stuff onto the line. Decent straightforward chap Cunningham is, but a sheol of a layer when it shoots him. Of course some of you fellas knows him. Medium-sized man, but one of them hard, wiry, deep-chested, deceivin' fellas. See him slinging that heavy red gum stuff about as if it was broad palin'. Of course he was only 23, and fellas of that age don't know their own strength. His bullocks was fearful low at the time on account of a trip he had out to Wilcannia with flour, and that's how he come to take this job. Never mind Cunningham, he's dead now, observed Donovan indifferently. Well, as I was telling you, pursued Saunders, we walked that bend the whole night, singing out, "Henry, Henry," and in the morning we was just as far as when we started. Tom, he clears off to the station before daylight to get help, and by this time I'd come to the conclusion that the kid must be in the river or out on the plains. I favoured the river a lot, but I bethought me of where this deadwood fence had been burnt to get it out of our road before the grass got dry. So I starts at one end to examine the line of soft ashes that divided the bend off of the plain, and hardly a sign of traffic across it yet. Hadn't went not 15 chain before I bumps up agin the kid's tracks, plain as ABC crossing out towards the plain. Cooeys for Cunningham, shows him the tracks, and the two of us follows the line of ashes right to the other end to see if the tracks come back. No, tracks. So we tells the missus, and she clears out for the plain and me after her. Cunningham, he collars his horse and out for the plain too. Station chaps turns up in ones and twos, and when they seen the tracks, they scattered for the plain too. Mostly young fellas on good horses, some of them good enough to be worth entering for a saddle or the like of that. Curious how horses was better and cheaper them days than what they are now. I had a brown mare that time, got her off of a traveller for 3 notes, and you pass her by without looking at her. But of all the deceiving goers you ever come across, no odds about the mare, she's dead long ago, interposed Thompson. About 2 o'clock, continued Saunders cheerfully, I was dead beat and leg-tired, and I went back to the tent to get a bite to eat, and coming back again I went round to have another look at the tracks. Now, thinks I, what road would that little wanderer be likeliest to head from here? And I hitches myself up on a big old black log that was laying about a chain past the tracks, and I sat there for a minute thinking like sheol. You wouldn't call it a big log for the Murray or the Lower Goulburn, but it was a fair-sized log for the Murrumbidgee. I seen some whopping red gums in Gippsland too, but the biggest one I ever seen was on the Goulburn. Of course, when I say big, I mean measurement. I ain't thinking about hollow shells with no timber in 'em. This tree I'm speaking about had 11,200 and some odd feet of timber in her, and Jack Hargrave, the fellow that cut her, his troubles is over too, murmured Baxter. Well, as I was telling you, I began to fancy I could hear the whimper of a kid far away. Imagination, thinks I. Listens fit to break me neck. Here's it again. Seemed to come from the bank of the river. Away I goes, hunts round, listens, calls, "Henry!" Listens again. Not a sound. Couple of the station hands happened to come round, and I told them. Well, after an hour of searching and listening, the 3 of us went back to where I heard the sound. I hitches myself up onto the log again, and says I, "This is the very spot I was," says I, "when I heard it." And before the word was out of my mouth, verb, me, if I didn't hear it again. "There you are," says I. "What the sheol are you blathering about?" says they. "Don't you hear the kid?" says I. "Oh, that ain't the kid, you fool," says they, looking as wise as Solomon and not letting on they couldn't hear it. But four and all they parted and rode round and round as slow as they could crawl, stopping every now and again and listening for all they was worth, and me sitting on the log puzzling me brains. At last I hears another whimper. "There you are again," says I. And one cove, he was stopped close in front of the butt end of the log at the time, and he jumps off his horse and sticks his head in the holler of the log and lets a oath out of him. Fearful fella to swear he was. I disremember his name just now, but he'd been on Grundle ever since he bolted from his old man's place in Ballarook Forest on account of a licking he got, and it was hard to best him among sheep. And now I recollect his name was Dick. Dick! It's just on the tip of my adjective tongue. "No matter his name," interposed Hellsmoke. "He have joined the great majority too." "Well, as I was saying," continued the patient Saunders, "we listened at the mouth of the holler and heard the kid whining inside, and when we sung out to him he was as quiet as a mouse. And we struck matches and tried to see him, but he was too far along, and the log was a bit crooked, and when you got in a couple of yards the hole was so small you'd wonder how he done it. Anyhow, the two station blokes rode out to pass the word, and the most of the crowd was there in half an hour. The kid was a good 30 foot up the log, and there was no satisfaction to be got out of him. He wouldn't shift, and by we come to the impression that he couldn't shift. And at long and at last we had to chop him out like a bee's nest. Turned out after that the little stray had found himself out of his latitude when night come on, and he'd got gumption enough to set down where he was and wait for morning. He'd always been told to do that if he got lost, but by and by he heard "Henry, Henry," booming and bellowing back and forward across the bend in the dark, and he thought the Booty Man and the Bunyip and the Banshee and Sheol knows what all was after him. So he found this holler log, and he thought he couldn't get far enough into it. He was about 7-year-old then, and that was in 71, the year after the big flood, and the shearing was just about over. How old would that make him now? 19 or 20. He left his old man 3 years ago to travel with a sheep drover named Sepp Halliday, and he's been with the same bloke ever since. Most likely some of you chaps knows this Sepp. Stout butt of a fellow with a red beard. Used to mostly take flocks for trucking at Deniliquin, but that got too many at it like everything else, and he went out back Cooper's Creek way with 3,000 gunbar yows the beginning of last winter, and I ain't heard of him since he crossed at Wilcannia. No wonder, I observed. He's gone aloft like the rest. There was a pause, broken by Stevenson in a voice that brought constraint on us all. Bad enough to lose a youngster for a day or two and find him alive and well. Worse beyond comparison when he's found dead. But the most fearful thing of all is for a youngster to be lost in the bush and never found, alive or dead. That's what happened to my brother Eddie when he was about 8 years old. You must remember it, Thompson. Wasn't my father out on the search, replied Thompson. Tom's father too. You were living on the upper Campaspe. Yes, continued Stevenson, clearing his throat. I've been thinking over it every night for these 25 years, and it seems to me the most likely thing that could have happened to him was to get jammed in a log like that other little chap. Then, after 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, the log gets burned and nobody notices a few little bones crumbled among the ashes. I was 3 or 4 years older than Eddie, he resumed hoarsely, and he just worshipped me. I'd been staying with my uncle in Kyneton for 3 months going to school, and Eddie was lost the day after I came home. We were out gathering gum, 4 of us altogether, about 1.5 miles from home, and I got cross with the poor little fellow and gave him 2 or 3 hits, and he started home by himself crying. He turned round and looked at me just before he got out of sight among the trees, and that was the last that was ever seen of him, alive or dead. Oh, God, when I think of that look, it makes me thankful to remember that every day brings me nearer to the end. The spot where he turned round is in the middle of a cultivation paddock now, but I could walk straight to it in the middle of the darkest night. Yes, he started off home crying. We all went the same way so soon afterward that I expected every minute to see him on ahead. At last we thought we must have passed him on the way. No alarm yet, of course, but I was choking with grief to think how I'd treated the little chap. So I gave Maggie and Billy the slip and went back to meet him. I knew from experience how glad he would be. Ah, well, the time that followed is like some horrible dream. He was lost at about 4 in the afternoon, and there would be about a dozen people looking for him and calling his name all night. Next day, I dare say, there would be about 30. Next morning, my father offered £100 reward for him, dead or alive, and 5 other men guaranteed £10 each. Next day, my father's reward was doubled, and 5 other men put down their names for another £50. Next day, government offered £200. So between genuine sympathy and the chance of making £500, the bush was fairly alive with people, and everyone within 30 miles was keeping a lookout. No use. The search was gradually dropped till no one was left but my father. Month after month he was out every day, wet or dry, and my mother waiting at home with a look on her face that frightened us, waiting for the news he might bring. And time after time he took stray bones to the doctor, but they always turned out to belong to sheep or kangaroos or some other animal. Of course, he neglected the place altogether and it went to wreck. And our cattle got lost, and he was always meeting with people that sympathised with him and asked him to have a drink, and you can hardly call him responsible for the rest. However, on the anniversary of the day that Eddie got lost, my mother took a dose of laudanum, and that brought things to a head. My father had borrowed every shilling that the place would carry to keep up the search, and there was neither interest nor principal forthcoming, so the mortgagee, Wesleyan minister, I'm sorry to say, had to sell us off to get his money. We had 3 uncles, each of them took one of us youngsters, but they could do nothing for my father. He hung about the public houses, getting lower and lower till he was found dead in a stable one cold winter morning. That was about 4 years after Eddie was lost. Stevenson paused and restlessly changed his position, then muttered in evident torture of mind, "Think of it. While he was going away crying, he looked back over his shoulder at me without a word of anger, and he walked up against a sapling and staggered, and I laughed. Great God, I laughed." That was the end of the tank sinker's story, and silence fell on our camp. Doubtless each one of us recalled actions of petty tyranny toward leal, loving, helpless dependents or inferiors in strength, actions which now seem to rise from the irrevocable past, proclaiming their exemption from that moral statute of limitations which brings self-forgiveness in course of time. The complete reading of Such Is Life is now available as an audiobook or in a format suitable to download to your computer.